How's it going, American History students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you to finish Unit 7. So we're going to talk about Reconstruction. This is the period of time after the Civil War, so from about 1865 to 1876, in which we are rebuilding America after the Civil War has torn it apart. You have many different plans changing in Reconstruction plans as you go throughout that time period. So let's finish up Unit 7. Thaddeus Stevens leads a group called the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans control a majority of Congress. Now, Lincoln is a Republican, but he's not what he calls a radical Republican. A radical Republican wants to punish the South severely for the sin of slavery, especially in the post-Civil War America. Whereas Lincoln doesn't necessarily want to punish the South, but rebuild the country, bring it together. So this is where you have a big split in the Republican Party. But as long as Lincoln's alive, of course, the president will supersede anybody in Congress, such as Thaddeus Stevens or even Charles Sumner, who's a radical Republican, if you remember him from when Preston Brooks hit him upside the head with a cane in Unit 6 when they were debating slavery on the Senate floor. Let's look at some different Reconstruction plans. Let's focus on Lincoln's. Let them up easy, with malice toward none and charity for all. Think about this. No ill will toward the South, he says. No hard feelings. It's over. You guys lost, but now it's time to make you part of the United States of America again. So he puts into place, right after the Civil War, right after you have Lee surrender to Grand Appomattox Courthouse, a very laid-back plan to readmit those 11 states into the Union. He calls it the 10% plan. As long as 10% of a state's population will pledge their allegiance back to the United States, then they're readmitted to the Union as part of the USA once again. He also pardoned Confederates and Confederate generals, whereas the Radical Republicans wanted to punish them. Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, while it would have brought the country together, was never implemented because, of course, he's going to be killed by John Wilkes Booth. So instead, you get the Radical Plan for Reconstruction. This is also known as Radical Reconstruction or Military Reconstruction, a way to punish and control the South, a way to essentially police against racism. So, the South is divided up into 5 military zones that are policed by the United States military. They are full out occupied. The military is there to police against racism. So what you see is a quick ascendancy of African Americans right after the Civil War to higher level jobs, such as dentists, such as doctors, such as mayors, such as state house, state senate. It's overnight going from property to professionals. And this is the way it should be. This is the morally right thing to do after dehumanizing them since the inception of America. At the same time, of course, the South, already bitter after their loss in the Civil War, is not going to respond too kindly to it. But as long as the military is there, African Americans ascend quickly in the South post-Civil War. But once the military leaves, that's going to change. But before we get there, let's look at the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson had the tremendous task of trying to fill the shoes of arguably the greatest president we've ever had. He was wishy-washy on his plans for Reconstruction. You know, sometimes he wanted to be tough, sometimes he wanted to be lenient. He never picked a clear lane on Reconstruction, which kind of just led to Thaddeus Stevens pushing him over and implementing radical Reconstruction. He is one of only 3 presidents to be impeached. Of course, you have him, Bill Clinton, and President Trump. Andrew Johnson was impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. So impeachment is an indictment of a crime. It's not removal from office. Impeachment is when a majority of the House essentially charges you with a crime. Then it goes to the Senate for conviction and removal, in which you need 67 of 100 senators to convict the sitting president and remove him from office. If it falls short of 67, I think Clinton was 2 votes short. This was a little closer than Trump's, and Trump's was nowhere near the 67 votes needed to remove him from office. So essentially, the three impeachments you've had, Johnson, Clinton, Trump, they've all been indictments of crimes rather than convictions of crimes, despite evidence sometimes pointing the other direction. But Johnson is kind of, for all three of those impeachments, his is, I think, you could argue the legitimacy of all three of those impeachments, but this one is kind of like, really, Congress? He violated something called the Tenure of Office Act, which said that you cannot fire a member of your cabinet, your presidential staff, like Secretary of War, Secretary of State, that type of thing, Secretary of Education, without approval from Congress. Well, Andrew Johnson inherited all of Lincoln's people, which is a very strong-willed cabinet of Stanton and Seward, the team of rivals, Lincoln called them. So he wanted his own people. So he fired, I believe it was the Secretary of War, Stanton, he fired. Or asked to step down. It's not really a firing. This is just kind of commonplace that when a new president comes in, they get to staff those secretary positions as they see fit. Now, he's inheriting this from Lincoln, so I understand that. He's not an elected president. So he fires one of the cabinet secretaries, and at this time, you had to get approval from Congress to do that. Since that was a violation of federal law, they decide the House does to impeach him. Again, he's not convicted by the Senate, so he remains in office. So let's talk about the end of Reconstruction. In the election of 1876, you had two candidates, a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, and a Democrat, Sam Tilden. And in 4 states, the election was uncertifiable. Too close to call, problems with ballots in other states. I think it was Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, and one other state. They couldn't come to a clear winner, so they couldn't award their electoral votes. So, much like in 1824 with the corrupt bargain, this is going to go to the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, the U.S. House of Representatives is Democratic, so you imagine, logic would tell you they would pick their guy, right? They would pick Sam Tilden, Democrat. But there is some difference in opinion regarding Reconstruction between Tilden, the Democratic nominee for president, and the Democratic House of Representatives majority. Tilden is for continuing Reconstruction. He thinks that it's necessary to make equality last in this country between black and white people, at least for a little bit longer. Hayes is kind of indifferent on it. You know, if Reconstruction continues, that's kind of been the Republican stance, pro-Reconstruction, so you would figure that's where he would be. But he's not as pro-Reconstruction as other members of the Republican Party. But Tilden wants to continue Reconstruction. The Democrats in the House want to end it. So the Democrats in the House go to the Republicans and they say, hey, we will turn on our candidate. We will turn on Sam Tilden. We will vote for Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, for president if he can promise us that he will end Reconstruction in the South, because we know Tilden's not going to. Of course, the Republicans take that deal. They want the power. They want the presidency. Any party would. So a Democratic House chooses a Republican president. And this is the Compromise of 1877. Reconstruction ends in the South. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president. Also a fun fact, Hayes was the first president to have a telephone in the White House. Now, Hayes ends Reconstruction, pulls the military out. So what you have is a racial backlash. You have very, very mad, racist Southern whites who have been kind of held back on a leash from the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, 1865 to 1877, and now they're going to do everything they can in their power to disenfranchise African Americans in the South. Scallywags and Carpetbaggers. Scallywags were white Southerners that supported Reconstruction. Carpetbaggers were people from the North that would come down to a heavily damaged South post-Civil War and try to profiteer off of people who were trying to just make it. Used as a derogatory term sometimes by Southerners to describe Northerners. Black codes different than slave codes. These were different from state to state. Obviously, in states like Alabama, Mississippi, they were much worse than maybe a state like Virginia or even North Carolina. These are different laws, state by state in the South, that disenfranchise black voters, that limit the rights of black citizens. You see some of them there. Couldn't vote in some states, couldn't join a militia, couldn't testify. Different states, different rules. The KKK, there were 3 versions of the KKK, the terrorist hate group. The 2 most famous versions are the first and the third. The first were striking back against African Americans post-Civil War and were usually former Confederates. And the third is the one that tried to fight against people like Dr. King and prevent the civil rights movements of the 1960s from happening. The second, not as significant. Freedmans Bureau. So this was something that was set up by Lincoln. It was essentially a stopgap residence for former slaves where they could stay for up to a year, be provided food, be provided shelter, clothing, until they could get on their feet and find a job. This would have been a success. It's a good notion. But when Lincoln is assassinated, the Freedmen's Bureau doesn't get the money it needs, so they kind of fail. But beyond that, they don't get the money they need for protecting, for the security of these Freedmen's Bureaus. So what ends up happening is they become an easy target for people like the KKK, and African Americans become afraid to use these Freedmen's Bureau. The Solid South were attempts by state legislatures, city and local governments to disenfranchise, keep black voters from actually voting. These included things like literacy tests, a poll tax you had to pay to vote, and a grandfather clause. Sometimes this is also known as the Jim Crow laws, more on Jim Crow in American too. But the grandfather clause is, at this time at least, the most hurtful, because if your grandfather was a slave, then you couldn't vote. Well, most of African Americans in the South who were recently free or just were missed slavery by being born free after 1865, their grandfathers were all slaves. So essentially, despite the amendments, black people couldn't vote. Speaking of those amendments, the 13th ends slavery. The 14th defines citizenship. But it says equal protection under the law for all. It's one of the more complicated amendments, but it's not supposed to matter your race, your religion, you're supposed to be your gender, you're supposed to be protected under the law. 15th gave black males the right to vote, but again, there were all those Jim Crow laws, Solid South laws, whatever you want to call them, to disenfranchise African American voters in the South. Typical job for freed slaves, tenant farmers, so very low paid farmers, and sharecroppers. They were paid in crops that they could use to feed their family or sell on the side. That's going to do it for Unit 7. There is kind of a little half unit that bridges the gap from American 1 to American 2. We'll see where we're at on time, whether we get to that. This is kind of the official end of the American 1 curriculum. So if I don't see you again on these video lessons, stay safe, wash your hands, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all that stuff. Thank you so much for your work. If you have any questions, email me, bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org.